sorry, Navdeep on this side. Rose Prime as well as. So he's also PhD guy. And that girl is a PhD. So, okay, so let me introduce Professor Garima Sharma. So as you would have seen in the announcement, she is a faculty at the school, Epistemic School of Government at University of New Mexico. She's part of the strategy area there, but her interest primarily is on sustainability issues. Though officially, so she also did a PhD from Case Western in the OB area. PhD and subsequent work is more cross-functional nature, including sustainability. So she's going to talk about a topic which I think is quite relevant at IMA because we keep three buckets we talk about capability evaluation. One of that bucket deals with the impact on practice, working with executives. So I think something which is of quite relevance.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you so much for having me here. It is so exciting. As Anand said, I'm an assistant professor at University of New Mexico, which is not in Mexico. It is a beautiful town in the US, southwest of US. This paper that I'm presenting today, actually even before that, I should tell you this quick story. Anand and I have been working together for almost 4 or 5 years now. And we published a paper together this summer, and this is the first time I met him face to face. So that's sort of the beauty of technology. And when he invited me to, would you like to do this? I sort of jumped at the opportunity to, meet him.
We have a common friend actually, so another faculty introduced us, so it's not purely virtual.
Yes.
Somebody else introduced us, and then we were working together.
Yeah. So the paper that I'm going to present today is, I'm very, very passionate about the topic because I'm, like Anand said, I'm a sustainability scholar. So I think to make impact on social and environmental issues, you cannot, but you require actors from different sectors. And what I have been studying over the past couple of years is that how do you bring researchers and managers together to solve sustainability issues, which, as all of us can attest, is not an easy task because researchers and managers come from different worlds, and that's sort of, we're playing off of that in the title. So again, the phenomena that we're studying is this notion that, if you look at this picture, this object in the middle, for this guy, it's a W, for this girl, probably it's a 3, for this one, it's a, E and M. So it's the same object, but just because where they are sitting or their vantage point of view, they see the same object differently. And in the literature, this is often called as the research practice gap. Because us as academics, our worlds are so esoteric, we have our own language, we have our own meaning of words, everything else, that it's very hard for us to sort of impact practice, the knowledge that we generate for it to reach practice. And a lot of work has already been done in what's called bridging the research practice gap. It says that, it pretty much lists what are the differences. We wanted to understand, okay, here are the differences, but from everything that we know about knowledge co-creation work or knowledge production work, differences are helpful in knowledge creation if you're able to navigate them. So we were interested in understanding how does that look like when you think about sustainability issues and when you think about this notion of researchers and managers coming together. So we'll turn to what is existing in the literature around what's called the research practice gap. Again, as I said, the prior literature is pretty much focused on listing the differences. So some of the differences they talk about is we use different languages. I'm sure no CEO uses words like sense-making, but we have our own, in our own academic training, we have our own language, and managers have their own language. They have different time horizons. So if you tell a manager that the outcome will be 3 years from start of the project, it's probably not going to fly. They have shorter time horizons for performance. For us, it takes years and years to produce knowledge. And then, mostly another way to understand is that managers are very interested in sort of what's generally called the business case or the performance. So when it comes to knowledge, it's all about what knowledge for what. So what? What's the impact? What's the outcome? What's the performance? But for us as academics, we really don't care as much. We care equally about failure and success, and we're really interested in, okay, what is the difference between failure and success? So because of the focus on listing the differences, what has happened is that the current literature has treated this notion of bridging as pretty much a knowledge translation problem. So what they say is that, okay, because the managers do not understand our language, I'm going to produce the knowledge as I want, and I'm going to translate it and sort of give it to you in a way you can access it. And that's sort of been how you impact practice. However, and a parallel stream of work is also talked about knowledge as asking the relevant question. So they say that, okay, you don't have to collaborate, but only collaborate to find the right question. And once you have that, go do your own work and produce research as you want to produce. As long as you've figured out the question, you will impact practice. However, other scholars have really talked about what is called bridging as knowledge production problem. So they're saying that, okay, for us to impact practice, we really need to partner with managers, and we can't just translate, and we can't just stop at asking the relevant question. However, in this work, mostly it's conceptual studies that talk about frameworks such as engaged scholarship, and there's a huge dearth of empirical work to understand how does that knowledge production happen. So we turned to other literature that has more deeply talked about knowledge production, and one of that literature is what's called epistemic culture. So what is epistemic culture? Epistemic culture is basically what's called the amalgamations of these practices and arrangements that make up how we know what we know. So it's called the ways of knowing. So for example, for us as academics, we get trained into certain ways of knowing, like how do you design a study, how do you conduct a study, et cetera, et cetera. So underpinning an epistemic culture is this notion of practices. So practices are generally socially recognized, they are recurrent, and they are materially bounded. So for example, for a carpenter to be recognized in the practice of carpentry, he or she should be following a certain set of practices that the whole carpentry profession recognizes. So for an epistemic culture to be defined by practices, the entire culture must recognize it and accept it. So for researchers, some of the characteristics of epistemic culture are this notion of production of abstract knowledge, elimination of alternate explanation, etc. And for managers, similarly, some of the characteristics of their epistemic culture is insights from experience, validation based on performance, etc. So again, huge difference. Another notion that is relevant for our study and that we hugely draw upon related to epistemic culture is this notion of epistemic objects. So epistemic objects pretty much mean that any object that is involved in scientific investigation. So most of this work by Norcetina and other people, they have studied laboratory scientists, and they've studied their work in understanding how do they use these objects to generate knowledge and produce that knowledge to be accessed by others. Again, there are two parallel views that I'm going to draw upon when I theorize around our findings. One is called the embodiment of knowledge. The embodiment of knowledge view pretty much means that knowledge is represented in the object that is produced. So what does that mean? That things like BCG product portfolio matrix, it sustains or endures across time and space. Latour has called it as immutable mobiles. It says that the object holds knowledge. You can take it from one place to another, and it's representing the knowledge of the creator. As opposed to enactment of knowing, which is comes from Orlikowski and others' tradition that says that there is nothing like fixed characteristics of object. There is no representation of knowledge in object. The only knowledge is in its use, the object's use. So what they call knowing. They reject this notion of knowledge as an object, and they say that knowing is the only knowledge out there. And, you can only understand when you use the object. So we draw on all of these and say that, okay, the existing studies on what's called knowledge creation across epistemic culture, that is pretty much assumed that actors from across the epistemic cultures have equivalent what we call the epistemic authority, which means who has the authority to produce knowledge. For example, in Bechke's case, she has studied occupational communities like technicians and engineers, and she studied how they come together to create knowledge. But again, she's assuming that both of them have equal chance and authority to produce knowledge. Similarly, Matsharas and others, in their study of cross-functional teams, they have studied how different teams with equal epistemic authority, obviously they do not say it, but they're assuming that both of them have equal chance to produce knowledge, and that goes for Carlyle's work also. In our case, if we think about researchers and managers, in general, the role of researcher compared to manager, the authority for producing knowledge resides with the researcher, you know. So when you bring them together, the default role that researcher takes is sort of this authority of producing knowledge, and managers often see them as themselves as consumers of knowledge. So there's, to begin with, an unequal epistemic authority, which all of these people haven't really considered, and we feel is valuable in better understanding knowledge creation. And others have done calls, like conceptually they've asked that we should pay attention to differences in knowledge asymmetry, inequality in opinion and beliefs, but again, empirical work has sort of assumed that this authority is equal, and hence we ask, given the differences in epistemic culture, how do researchers and managers co-create knowledge? So how did we do that? We studied a nonprofit in Canada. I'm using a pseudonym called NetBuzz. What this nonprofit does is that it's interested in creating a network of researchers and managers for, again, generating knowledge. It has a council of managers. It gets them together every year, and they identify priorities. And they say, okay, these are, let's say, the 5 priorities of sustainability issues facing businesses that we can answer through research. Then what NetBuzz does is that it selects one topic out of the identified priorities. So let's say sustainability reporting. Now that they have chosen the topic, they recruit the best academic expert in the world to lead the topic, and they invite 3 or 4 managers out of this big group and say, hey, would you like to join this team? So now this researcher manager team works together for a period of a year, and they follow the traditional research design as we would do, starting with a question, literature review, data collection, sense making, theorizing. But the twist is that instead of the researcher doing all of these tasks alone, she has co-partners who are practitioners or managers. Then NetBuzz translates these findings, and they are widely available on the website. For our study, we focused on the second part. We were interested in understanding how does this process of conducting research together look like. So to do that, we observed 2, yeah. Yeah, they get government funding.
They raise the funding.
Right, yeah. So this, yeah, and they're not paying either the researcher or managers. They're just bringing them together. I know that most of their fundings are used in this part, translating and disseminating. So they use.
How expensive might one initiative?
It's a good question. I don't think I have the numbers. I mean, I have been involved with them for 2 years studying this project, but I want to say collectively, given all the efforts, I want to say about 100,000 Canadian dollars. That would be my guess estimate. Yeah. But do you have, where are you going with the question?
No, I mean, just, I'm trying to understand the context of research, because typically I would believe the way resources flow would also drive knowledge creation and the process of knowledge creation.
Yeah.
And so this, I guess, this is not, for instance, funded research.
Right.
By sort of say an entity or corporation, etc.
Right. That's a good question. And our reviewers have asked us that question. And in fact, one of our interviewees, the researcher, said that because the purse strings are not held by the corporates, we have more freedom so in some ways to sort of do the research like a researcher. So I think you're pointing to a very relevant insight. So we observed 2 year-long projects. One project asked the question, how do managers think long-term for sustainability? Other asked the question, how do firms collaborate with competitors for sustainability. Again, different projects. We first observed this one for a year and the second one for another year. And this is just a typical timeline of the project. You know, you define the scope, keywords, interim findings. Again, the important point to note here is that this pretty much follows our traditional research design. The only place being these dots are the monthly meeting where researchers and managers would come together. Then they would disband and sort of do their own work, come back together, you know, every month. In addition to doing two-year observations, we interviewed 57 managers, researchers, and NetBus staff members who had been involved in 13 such projects earlier. And we were asking them similar questions around, you know, what was your motivation? When did you think you were on the same page? You know, when were the moments of connection? When did you think you weren't heard? Things like that. Really asking them about specifying specific moments where they thought that, you know, they really co-created knowledge. So in terms of findings, I'm going to tell you the findings in 3 separate buckets, but they're connected with each other. First is that I'm just going to tell you what we heard as the differences in epistemic culture. A lot of it is intuitive, a lot of it is what I've already said, but I think it forms the bedrock of sort of the main core findings that we have. Then I'm going to tell you about these moments of co-creation. Now, why is that important is that in these moments, these differences were momentarily suspended. You know, so co-creation were defined by suspending how they individually knew based on the epistemic culture, and they were sort of creating knowledge together. So this is connected to the first one. And then the third bucket is really, once we know these moments, what really defines them. So I'm going to tell you about the practices that were underlying in these moments. So differences in epistemic culture, we heard a lot about researchers and saw a lot about researchers focusing on how and managers really focusing on what. A little repetitive of what I've already told you, but here's the researcher in our project who's saying the managers were pushing her to say, okay, tell us about the characteristics or the factors that drive success in collaboration. And she's in the field and she's struggling and she's saying it is not black and white. I cannot tell you about success or failure. And so she's here saying there's no way of measuring the performance as I see it right now. It is not that black and white. And the managers kept asking her what is the characteristics of performance, but she didn't want to go there. Here they're saying, this manager is saying again, what are the conditions for success, for failure? So how do you address those things? I've worked with academia, and sometimes, no offense to academia, that is just not part of their experience. So he's identifying how they're different from what is part of a researcher's experience. We also saw that researchers, and all of us in this room will identify with it, we are trained to keep data separate from interpretation. You know, our data collection is separate from interpretation. There's a process that we follow. So this guy is saying in the meeting, this researcher is saying that the managers are asking him what he thinks are questions beyond the data he's collected until now. So he's again pushing back and saying that we do not want to jump the gun and make more interesting claims that are only partly supportive. We want to be able to get through all the stages. Could I tell you more interesting things? Yes. Could I give you more details? Yes. But it's jumping ahead of the process. So again, he's trying hard to keep data different from interpretation. While managers, sort of in their lived experience, they blur the two. They're saying it's all okay to have these fancy frameworks, but what I really learned from is when you bring these stories to the table, when you give us example, when I hear others understanding how they struggle with their day-to-day reality. So he's saying, this manager is saying that it's pretty much blurring it. There's no separation between sort of what is data and what is he concluding out of it. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly just show you these 3 differences that we found. These are the 2 I already explained, and the other was, again, defending the research process, and managers were exploring ideas. Again, these differences form the bedrock of sort of understanding moments of creation, which we call in qualitative work, how do I know co-creation when I see it in my data, right? So how did we know co-creation when we saw it in our data was that first, we saw what we call deviation from what was their native way of knowing, right? So they were deviating from that. And more concretely, after this moment of co-creation, there was a concrete change in the object, which was either a framework or a visual that they were developing together. So by these two indicators, we could identify that this interaction or this moment is when co-creation is happening, and otherwise it's absent. So let me take you to this one meeting. Again, in our paper, and I'm happy to share a copy with you, we define each of these interactions that say moments of co-creation, but just come with me to this one moment where this research team studying long-term thinking for sustainability, he brings in a framework to the meeting. And this framework is, actually I'll just jump to that. So this framework is where he's defined high short-term returns, low short-term returns, low long-term returns, and high long-term returns. And he comes to the meeting, he displays this framework, and he says that we reviewed the entire 127 studies on long-term thinking, and here is how we summarize. We've created buckets of those meetings. So this managers asked, do these bubbles indicate the actions that the organization could take? So now this manager is really looking for, okay, what do these bubbles really mean? Are these prescription for me to take action? Now this researcher is saying, he's explaining his process, but he's accepting that it was a bit of a challenge. He says, we could not just refer to action because the same action could have high or low returns, and we identify it as a deviation from way of knowing because in moments that were defined by lack of co-creation, the researchers were always giving a firm answer and saying, when manager asked them, they would say, hey, it was action and this is how I coded it, or not. But here he is deviating from way of knowing by expressing uncertainty and saying that for us it was a challenge and we could not just refer to the action, there is more going on here. So now this facilitator from NetBus, who's facilitating the meeting, says, okay, how much of this is based on evidence or data, and how much is this your own interpretation? Now she's trying to sort of, again, separate the two. And now the researcher says that, okay, we have probably moved a bubble or two more to the center than what our data would say. Again, we identify it as deviation from way of knowing because the researcher is saying that even though my data said that this is where bubble should be, I used my own intuition to move the bubble more to the center, which is what you would expect sort of in an intuitive, practice-oriented way of knowing rather than an academic way of knowing. So now another manager gets all excited about this framework, and she's saying that, hey, I can draw a sustainability example. So you did all of that for a regular organizational actions, but I can draw a similar example for sustainability actions. So what she's saying, and why we think she's deviating from her way of knowing, is that she's taking an abstract concept, high long-term, low long-term. She's taking this abstract framework and going back to her experience and trying to fit in her experience into that framework. Again, we identify this abstraction as deviation from how she usually knows. Then the researcher says, we could use everyone's help. What he's saying, in the moments that were defined by a lack of co-creation, the researchers were closing the process to the managers. They were saying that this is the answer we have and consume it, while here they're saying that whatever our data has told us, we are okay to let you change it. So we could use everyone's help. You can take this, you can modify it with me. And in addition to sort of these, some indicators of deviation, they also, this manager and researcher sort of took this, and in the final report changed the framework to include here. So there was a concrete change in objects as well, as opposed to many moments that lacked co-creation, where they went into the meeting with 2 or 3 page report and came out of the meeting with sort of the same report.
They also changed the title of the axis.
Right, yeah, they changed a lot of things. Yeah, they changed the title, obviously all these things. Yeah, apart from the bubbles, yeah. They revisited the entire conceptualization. What I skipped there and I wanted to see is that, this is sort of the long-term thinking project, and in the paper we define sort of the moments of co-creation by the star and the lack by the circles. So as you can see, they are far and few, so it's not like every moment was a moment of co-creation. They were harder than the others. It was more easier for them to stay in their epistemic culture and ways of knowing, and to come out was harder. The other thing that our reviewers have pointed toward us, asked us, is the notion that what about time? Can they be just staying together and meeting after meeting at the end of the project? They are such great friends that they no longer fight over differences. They can just co-create together. But as you can see in both, there is no chronology to co-creation. It wasn't about the time they stayed together. Yeah, so I think, so one is that, like I said, there was no change. So every meeting, there was an object in the middle. Either it could be a visual, a report, etc. The moments that lack co-creation, researchers came with that object. Even when the managers tried to say something, hey, what about this? They said, okay, we will think about it, or okay, we'll figure something out. Okay, so they were very close to the process of changing any of what they brought in. And I'll show you a little bit in practices. They were different interactions. So, the managers only asked questions to the researchers, and the researchers only gave answers, or there would be like 15 minutes of researchers just explaining the process of research, and managers just saying, okay, that's great, and moving on.
But given that researchers also in this different location, where they're coming in presenting to managers, would that not, and the questions that they might have received previously, would that not have perhaps already influenced what the researchers are coming into the meetings with, and therefore, can one look at that as co-creation itself?
Could you say more?
So, I'm coming into a different site. It's not a typical site for me as a researcher in terms of this research that I'm doing. I am doing it with managers. Given that I'm already influenced, affected by what I bring in, what I share, how do I generate these discussions, the nature of the discussions that I have, why wouldn't I call that as co-creation?
And yeah, that's a great question. So I have anecdotes, but I wish we had another project where we could compare researchers, which was like zero co-creation. And I have seen others in NetBus that are like that. But when we have the interviews that we have done, people have talked about projects where they just, so these are the words the managers used. The researcher already came with a preconceived framework, and the project ended with that framework. So, I do think that maybe there is the notion of sight, but I think our culture is so strong that when we enter into these meetings, I think we stick on to what we know, and just coming out of it is harder. So I don't think that just getting into a different kind of research project, we sort of, because these researchers ultimately, like with this project, he published a JOM piece. This one is sort of has an RNA, just like they want to publish this work. So I don't think that they're okay to let go of things like objectivity or however we've been trained in. So I think they do hang on to that. So I wouldn't say that the default is that they would be.
So are you saying that the process is not different for different kinds of projects?
You mean different kind of questions? Yeah, so that's another great question. I think so here's what we heard in the interview. When they asked a what question, so let's say, do consumers pay for sustainability? That was a different experience for researchers and managers, because it was a what question. But when they asked a how question, how do we competitors collaborate, when it was more process-based answer, it was easier for them to co-create. So definitely there is something about asking, sort of framing the right question. We did hear that. We don't have enough data about it to sort of theorize around it, but we did hear some of that in terms of what's the question they frame, changing sort of the influencing the process they engage in. So again, the last bucket sort of the findings is that now that we have identified the moments of co-creation, what practices really underlie these moments? And we identified 4 practices. I'm going to quickly take you through them. One is what we called asking questions, So in these moments of co-creation, It wasn't like the managers were asking questions to researchers and researcher was responding. Researchers also asked questions to managers. What do you think? Does this align with your experience? How would you change it? Can you come up and change it, the framework? As well, managers were asking questions to each other. So they were not only asking researchers about, have you considered this? They were looking to their peer and saying that, hey, you have been part of a collaboration like that. Would you agree with this researcher? What do you think happens? So in these moments, again, the authority to create knowledge was diffused, and more people were involved in it. Researchers were expressing uncertainty. They weren't saying that I have done my work, I'm the expert and I have the answer. They were saying things like, this framework will keep evolving, so don't hold back your answers. Sometimes they were saying that I haven't figured it out all yet, but I'll try to still answer this question for you, but I don't fully know what the final framework would look like. They were also identifying what was missing. So they were saying that, the right-hand column should have indicators of business impact, something we haven't captured here. So again, the framework or the object in between them wasn't treated as complete. There was a lot of incompleteness about the object, and they were identifying that incompleteness in real time. And finally, they were keeping the conversation open. So there were a lot of, we observed them going back and forth between slides in these moments. They were referring back to previous conversation, again with this notion that, it is a work in progress, it's an open conversation, and we can refer back, it's not a linear process. So what does all of that mean? The knowledge co-creation process that we are proposing here is this notion that if this is the researcher's epistemic culture, and if this is the manager's epistemic culture, these are the periods of separation when they sort of stay in their epistemic culture. These are the meetings where they come together and they have opportunity to have a moment of co-creation. And when they do have this co-creation moment, it is facilitated by what we call provisionality. And I'm going to explain that to you in a little bit what that means. So two contributions we are making is this notion of contribution to epistemic objects. So existing literature on epistemic objects in a lot of way conflicts because some of the work says that the actors must disembed themselves from what Fernari calls as existing institution to be able to work across cultures. While some of the other scholars, like Howard Grenville et al. Have said that actors do not have to unlearn. When they come together, their cultures are additive. So based on our findings, what we are saying to this literature is saying that when objects are treated as embodiment, when the researcher comes in with a framework that represents researcher's knowledge and it is not open to changing, that is when the first piece becomes relevant. That is when if the object holds the researcher's knowledge, then she has the epistemic authority and managers consume the knowledge, then the question of disembedding from current culture becomes salient. But when objects are treated as enactment, then they do not have to unlearn because they only momentarily have to suspend how they know, So it becomes additive. So because the previous literature has really looked at specific interactions, but haven't sort of zoomed out and seen these coming together in separation, they're unable to sort of distinguish between, when would embodiment make sense and when would enactment make sense. So what we are proposing to this literature is that co-creation is in this momentary shift from objects as embodiment to objects as enactment, So in moments of co-creation, when you treat the object and the middle as enactment, work in progress, and not representative of the researcher's knowledge, you're able to co-create. But you can sort of go back, and then that object becomes representative when it is used by others. And the last piece that I will leave you with is this notion of provisionality in practices, which is what I defined as surrounding the moment of co-creation. So, in these cases, the 4 practices that I identified, it was about seeing the object as incomplete, and that incompleteness invited actors to complete the object. So in that moment, because it was incomplete, researchers were able to let go of their epistemic authority. But what we're contributing to this literature, provisionality already exists as a concept in epistemic cultures and objects. However, provisionality is treated as this unintentional, continuously unfolding characteristic, not only characteristics, this process ontology, the ontology of object. Based on our data, we are offering provisionality or incompleteness as a very intentional practice that the researchers and managers engage in. And because it's intentional, because researchers and managers know that they're only going to momentarily engage in co-creation, and there is an end to the project where there will be completeness, we offer insight to this literature that there is another form of incompleteness that is intentional, can help in co-creation. So I'm going to stop here and let you ask questions if you have any.
But in some places, they deliberately, knowingly leave something open, and therefore that allows.
Yeah, so what we're saying is that when researchers are able to intentionally let go of their, so for me to say that it's okay for the manager to change my work, there is some intentionality behind me that in saying that, all right, it's okay for you to come and change what my data says, you know. So that's what we are saying, that sort of this notion of incompleteness that the researcher presents forth has some level of intentionality behind it. And also there is a time aspect to it as well. This literature says that based on process ontology, the objects are continuously unfolding. What we find is that, you know, the researchers and managers see an end to the unfolding, end to the incompleteness. They know that after a year, the project is going to end. That is why it's possible for them to sort of get into the discomforting zone and be able to sort of engage in this process. That's sort of the contrast we're creating here in describing provisionality. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that, I mean, is it a particular topic, a particular area that leads to this incompleteness, or are we saying it's a deliberate choice of the research?
Yes, it's the latter, you know. So I don't think the researcher is saying, okay, I'm going to present this as incomplete. I think what they're saying is that I'm going to open my process to the managers, you know. And by opening the process to the managers, they're not presenting the object as complete. So I don't think they're framing this as incomplete intentionally, but just by the virtue of opening the process, they're bringing in incompleteness to their work.
I'm completely new to this literature. Two thoughts came to mind. One, I work on industry, academia, technology linkage. So the first question that came to mind, if I want to understand that linkage, which involves some interaction between managers and scientists,
Right.
how do I use this to understand better? That's one. I'm asking very broad.
Yeah.
The second question relates to a research idea which I have been sort of harboring for a long time. I teach a course where design, technology, and management students come together to co-create. We have a technology domain, we form teams. They need to come up with potential applications, pick one which they see as potentially very good, develop a sort of good prototype, and then figure out how to take it to market. Right? Now, the purpose of the course, as far as I'm concerned as a teacher, is the process, not the end product. Right? Now, when I try and understand what is going on in the process, it's very difficult.
Right.
Right? And the closest I have come to understand the process is through one interaction where one of the students said that it was very difficult to work with management students, with the design students. And I pushed her and she said that when we started the interaction and we were supposed to come up with new technology applications,
Yeah.
through mind mapping, right? And what she said was that the course was good for me because at the end of the course, I understand the value of the Excel sheet, and I hope that the IMA students understand the value of the blank sheet.
Right.
Right? So,
Yeah.
and after that interaction, I've been trying to figure out whether I can launch a research project where I can collect data from these teams who typically have 10,
Yeah.
12 teams
Yeah.
a year and figure out how this process actually unfolds.
That's great. That's a great idea.
But so I have some clues on that from this, but I would like to hear more. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm asking too much.
No, I think this is fascinating, and I'll be happy to send you the working paper. It has a list of citations where people have studied that question in terms of cross-functional teams, in terms of cross-disciplinary new product development teams, and they have a lot of great insights that you can draw upon in terms of how would you study and where can you situate the literature. So definitely there's lots going on there in terms of cross-functional teams.
So these teams also, they're there for one course.
Right.
And they know
It's going to end. Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
So many of these things are providing interesting leads, but I don't know how long they take.
Yeah. No, that's a great opportunity for sure.
Any other questions? But have people looked at this from the perspective of technology transfer from academia to industry or co-creation between actors and in a general sense? Just we are looking at a particular situation.
Right.
Have you seen similar?
From technology transfer from academia to industry. No, I haven't seen in terms of technology transfer. I think I know people who are working on it. I'll be happy to connect you with them who are working on exactly what you're talking about technology transfer between different sectors, So I'll be happy to connect you with that. I haven't seen any empirical work that talks about it.
Into the process part. I mean, I know a lot of people who work on technology transfer, but not on kind of processes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I haven't seen an empirical work that I think there are different implications. We are hoping, I think sort of my personal agenda as a scholar is also to sort of, make co-creation more accessible to academia. So I think if we get this in print, it'll help us, So we've been feeding the data back to NetBus, and they have changed a lot of their processes of facilitation, of other things. So we already see impact, but sort of because our impact is more about, I care about the impact on the academic community. So this is sort of in the third round, and we're hoping in a few months it will be in print, so then it'll be easier to talk about it.
This idea of researchers letting go of epistemic authority, that seems to be a temporal thing that they do, right? When you actually write this up, you are still in some ways rooting some form of epistemic foundation in order to make visible the idea of provisionality.
Right.
And that's provisionality in practice of knowledge creation, but not provisionality in the practice of managerial practice.
Right.
Right?
Right, exactly.
To what extent then is this, is it suspension of epistemic authority? Is it letting go? Because in some ways what you're pointing out in the next thing, there's some, this idea of a process ontology. What are the ontological moorings of a knowledge creation process which are being interpreted through some epistemic foundation?
Right. Yeah, I don't know if I fully understood it, but I'll try to answer. So in the earlier version, we used this phrase, which you remove now, but it helped me situate the findings, is that they were not giving up what they know, they were giving up how they know, right? So I think there was definitely a grounding around what do researchers know, what the literature tells them. It is not about giving that up, or it's not about giving up how, it's really momentarily suspending how we know. So, in terms of, like I said, letting the managers change some of the frameworks, it's sacrilege, right? Like if you go tell an AMJ reviewer that, you let your informant change your framework after you made it, it's like you've lost all your objectivity, So in some ways, they're sort of saying that, okay, what you're telling me in this, even though I've collected my data outside this room, what you're telling me in this room is also data, So I'm going to take that into consideration, and I'm going to let you change my framework. So it's really about how they know, but they're definitely bringing what they know to the table.
On the presumption that the researchers are coming in at this with a positivist mode of inquiry, if it were alternative modes of inquiry, then there would be no possession of how, the sort of unfolding of the hermeneutic process of understanding. We are presuming that this is happening under a sort of overarching theme of positivist research.
Yeah, I think it's accurate to a certain extent. I think it gets even worse in positive. The phenomena gets even tighter in positive research. But I do think that even our current qualitative hermeneutic inquiry, the notion of being fly on the wall and being distant and being sort of interpretive monopoly on what your informants are telling you, and just this notion of questioning but bias, right? So I don't think that is fitting. This is not that. They're saying that, there's no bias. You know what I mean? Yeah. There's a great paper, if you're interested in that direction, by Arne Carlson and Carl Rhodes. They're talking about reflexivity, the way we currently know it in ethnography. It is, again, a very individualistic enterprise, right? So I go in the field, I'm making these notes, left-hand column, what I feel, right-hand column, what I see. I usually do not share that with my informants, right? Usually it's sort of this notion of reflexivity as an individual sense-making. But I think what Arne and Carl are saying is that, it has to be a co-creative enterprise. So they call it relational reflexivity. So I think that might be relevant to what you're asking. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. We're bringing a lot of that. And I spoke with Anand's students this afternoon around research design. And, so we talked in length about reflexivity in ethnography. And I think it's relevant for us training our students, in terms of alternate ways to gather knowledge. Yeah. That's it. Thank you so much for your time and engagement.